Hey everyone. Okay, this is the first video lecture for the week. Hopefully you've already watched the overview video for this week, which detailed not only what you have to do this week, but also gave you a little bit of a background on the end of the Cold War. So now I'm going to kind of pick up from that and talk a little bit about one of the events that has dramatically impacted U.S. immigration over the past 20 years, and that's the events around 9/11. The terrorist attacks of 9/11. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how it has impacted immigration. But the real main kind of thesis of this lecture, right, the main point that I'm going to try to get across to you is that 9/11 does two things. First, it opens up new places for immigration, right? So the immigrant community, right? Immigration starts to come in a more rapid pace from areas where it was not really very active before this. And specifically, the region I want to focus on is the Middle East. So what you'll see is that immigration really kind of spikes in the wake of 9/11 from the Middle East. The second thing, and this is the thing I'll probably go into in more depth, is that what 9/11 does is it associates immigration with concerns over security. And this is something that is, frankly, really new. Immigration before this, and as we'll see in the next lecture, sort of resistance to immigration, was rarely based upon concerns over national security. Right? If we think of nativism at the turn of the 20th century, the main concerns there were first sort of economic, right? The whole narrative about immigrants will take jobs. That was kind of bullet point number one for the nativist agenda. And then the second was sort of cultural and racial, right? Nativists didn't want people coming from certain regions, people from certain races, people from certain sort of cultural and ethnic communities coming into the United States, right? So there was a sort of economic and cultural resistance to immigration that was nativism in the turn of the 20th century. In the 21st century, we have seen a new element added to that, and that is a concern over security, right? And it has to do with the changes that happen to immigration law and the way that immigration happens in the wake of 9/11. So, without further ado, to that story, okay? So, 9/11 is probably a topic that you all know fairly well. I mean, I know that probably many of you were not born yet when the attacks of 9/11 happened. I think we're getting right to that point where my students are now a sort of post-9/11 generation, which is pretty weird to me. But yeah, you're probably fairly familiar with the basic story, though, right? On September 11th, 2001, there was a series of 4 coordinated terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, all of them having to do with essentially airplanes, right? Terrorists taking over airplanes and trying to steer those airplanes into important locations, right? So the 2 that we know about the best are probably the Twin Towers in New York City, the World Trade Center buildings in New York City. But there was also one airplane that hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and another that crashed in Pennsylvania. Yeah, all of these attacks were organized by a terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was based in various spots, but it was led by a man named Osama bin Laden, who was Saudi, who's a citizen of Saudi Arabia, but did sort of organize this networked terrorist organization throughout the Middle East region and throughout the world, even too. These attacks, very quickly after they happened, right, the U.S. government recognized them as acts of terrorism, right, that they were not accidents, they were not unrelated, they were, in fact, sort of deliberate acts of terrorism. And that's exactly what President George W. Bush said in his remarks on the evening of September 11th, right? He quoted, or he said specifically, right, that these attacks were, quote, deliberate and deadly terrorist attacks. And why this is important is because the attacks of 9/11 started a whole sort of national conversation over the dangers of terrorism. And terrorism became a major concern for a lot of Americans from that point on. One of the pieces of evidence that shows this really well is a series of Gallup polls that have been taking place in the U.S. for the past a few decades. And as a part of this Gallup poll, there's a specific question that asked about terrorism. It asked specifically, how worried are you that either you or a member of your family will become a victim of terrorism? So before the attacks of 9/11, the percentage of people who said very worried or somewhat worried, so essentially who answered in the affirmative, was around 24%. About a quarter of the country was worried about terrorism affecting their lives and the lives of the people that they know and their family. After 9/11, in the months after 9/11, that number spiked to 58%. Over half of the country said that they were concerned with terrorism, right, impacting their lives. Since then, that number has really sustained itself around the 40% range. And this chart kind of that you see right in front of you shows this. That still, it's almost half of the country that is really concerned that terrorism will impact their lives. Why is that important? That's important because that concern, that the significance of terrorism in the wake of 9/11, right, and the concern over terrorism, motivated some really important changes to the mechanisms of immigration in this country. And you see this best through changes in laws. There was a whole series of laws that were passed in the wake of 9/11, in the years following 9/11, that dramatically changed the system of immigration in this country. So I want to go over those laws in a little bit, but I want to kind of first start with a basic fact. So the people who carried out the terrorist attacks of 9/11 came into this country actually legally. And what I mean there is that they came through a program called the Non-Immigrant Program. This is essentially a sort of temporary visa program for people who want to come to the United States for temporary reasons. So you might think of like tourists, for example. People who want to come to the United States for tourism get these temporary visas that give them what's called non-immigrant status, right? And it essentially means you're not allowed to stay here, but you can be here for a very distinct period of time. The people that came into this country were actually here. They went through that process of non-immigrant, of gaining a non-immigrant status, right? And then did what they did, sort of on that status. That said, it does not mean that the changes in the wake of 9/11 pertain only to the non-immigrant status. It actually motivated changes to the entirety of the immigration system in the United States. And I want to go over some of the big laws that did this work, right? The first that we can focus on is the Patriot Act. This took place really very shortly after the attacks of 9/11 in October 2001. And what the main intent of the Patriot Act was to sort of provide the government with measures to increase sort of security, right? So there were increased permissions for the government to do surveillance of citizens. This is where we get sort of the government being allowed to wiretap phones and things like that. But it also increased the number and the funding to Border Patrol. And here's a sort of important thing, right? What the Patriot Act did, essentially, is start to associate immigration to national security. Essentially by saying that one of the ways that the country will remain secure is by further regulating and further sort of overseeing who is allowed in this country, who gets into this country, right? And so they did this first by increasing the amount of people, the amount of personnel and funding to Border Patrol, right? The second act that importantly impacts immigration in the wake of 9/11 is the acts that set up the entry-exit system in 2002. The entry-exit system is essentially a sort of system for providing further screening of people coming into the country, specifically like non-immigrants coming into the country, right? So it increased the levels of screening that are done to people applying for these non-immigrant status. And it also specified that people coming from certain regions had to undergo even tighter sort of surveillance measures. So people coming from the region of the Middle East had to actually not only apply for non-immigrant status in the ways that everyone else applied for non-immigrant status, but they also had to register on a registry in which they had to give their entire itinerary of the United States, where they would be, when they would be where, everything like that, right? And put their names down on this registry so that they could be tracked, right? And this was only for people in regions that were considered national security risks, right? Regions like the Middle East. The third act that we can think about is the Homeland Security Act, and this is really the big one. Because in 2002, what the Homeland Security Act does is it sets up a new branch of the government, the Department of Homeland Security. And this is a major branch of the U.S. government now, right? It is a cabinet level, it has a cabinet level position. The director of Homeland Security is a person who's on the presidential cabinet now. So with the Department of Homeland Security, which is given sort of the mission of protecting, securing the country, right? There's also under the Department of Homeland Security, there is also created a new wing of immigration enforcement called ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It's sort of a police force designated specifically for policing sort of immigration laws, right? And immigrants in this country, and finding and prosecuting specifically people who violate immigration law, right? But perhaps even more importantly, what the Homeland Security Act does is it takes the existing structure of immigration in this country, the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Services, and puts it in the Department of Homeland Security. And that is probably the most important thing that happens in the wake of 9/11, because all of a sudden, the entire bureaucracy for immigration services in this country get placed in the department whose main concern is security, right? Immigration is all of a sudden associated with the topic of and the concerns of and the bureaucracy of national security, right? And this is a first for American history, right? Immigration was never tied to the bureaucracy of like the military or national security before this. It takes this law, right, in 2002 to do it. And then finally, we can look at a law in 2005, the Real ID Act, that sort of has an impact on immigration as well, right? The Real ID Act promotes stricter rules for IDs. You have to provide all sorts of sort of corroborating evidence to get things like driver's licenses and things like that. But it also tightened the asylum process and required people who are applying for asylum, right, to provide, quote, corroborating evidence in order for their asylum request to be accepted. So what that means is that people who were fleeing countries where they felt that they were being persecuted, right? So think back to, say, the refugees coming from Cuba, during the Mariel crisis and things like that, right? They had to not only show up on U.S. soil, but they had to show up with corroborating evidence to prove that they were, in fact, being persecuted. The effect of this is this dramatically lowers the rate of acceptances of asylees, right? Because lots of people who are fleeing the country don't bring with them the kind of tangible evidence and proof that they need to prove that they are fleeing the country for the purposes that that asylum law sort of affords them acceptance into the United States. So those are the main legislative changes, and I think they're really important. What they do is they essentially associate immigration with security, right? And that becomes a theme in a lot of the conversations around immigration, really all the way up until today. In the next lecture, we'll kind of talk about that. The final thing I want to talk about, though, is that in the wake of 9/11, the United States decides to go to war, right, and go into military action in two different places, in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the years following, right, in 2001 and 2003. And what these wars do is they change, or they shift the places where immigrants are coming into this country, right? What wars have done throughout history, and we've seen throughout this course, is that wars displace people, right? In the wake of the war in Afghanistan, 1.2 million people were displaced in Afghanistan, right? In the wake of the war in Iraq, 1.8 million people were displaced from their homes, right? Many of these people applied for admission to entry into the United States through either asylum programs or through refugee programs. And so the number of people, of immigrants coming into this country from regions in the Middle East and South Asia really spikes in this period because of American involvement in these places, right? And here is just one kind of chart that sort of shows this. If you look at this chart and you look at the dramatic rise and increase of specifically immigrants from Iraq, right? That maps perfectly onto U.S. involvement in Iraq in 2003 all the way through 2006. So, to recap, right, big changes. Immigration is about security, and immigration starts to grow in regions like the Middle East.